The morning sun poured through the windows of JFK International Airport, glinting off Daniel Wright's wristwatch as he navigated the busy terminal. As the CEO of Wright Industries and now owner of several small companies, including an airline, his life had become a whirlwind of flights, meetings, and acquisitions. This trip to New York had been fruitful. He had secured a partnership with a major investor, one that promised to further elevate his brand and open doors for new ventures. Yet, despite his achievements, Daniel always preferred to travel quietly, blending in with the crowd and avoiding any pomp or special treatment. As he approached the check-in counter, he handed his boarding pass to the gate attendant, a young woman who barely glanced up before asking, "First class or economy?" Her tone was curt, almost dismissive, as she seemed to scan him in one quick, scrutinizing look. "Business class," Daniel replied, his voice smooth but firm. He noticed a flicker of surprise in her eyes as she looked up and saw him properly for the first time. She paused, holding his gaze a little longer than necessary, her expression shifting subtly to one of uncertainty. "Yes, of course," she finally replied, her voice faltering just slightly. "One moment." She seemed to hesitate before scanning his boarding pass, her movements stiff as if fighting an instinctive disbelief. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that, despite her polite facade, she hadn't quite believed he could belong in the business section. He tried to brush it off, but years of subtle and not so subtle moments like this had trained him to be more observant of these interactions. After a moment, she handed back his boarding pass, saying, "You're all set," but her demeanor remained uneasy. Daniel offered a polite nod and took his boarding pass, though the interaction left him with an all-too-familiar sense of unease. As he turned to board, he noticed other passengers being treated with more warmth, a small but perceptible difference. He filed the thought away, determined not to let it sour his mood. He made his way down the sleek, crowded jet bridge, his thoughts drifting to his journey so far. Growing up in an underprivileged neighborhood, he'd been taught to work twice as hard to get half as far. That lesson had stayed with him, driving him to build his empire. The hardships he'd faced had hardened him, yet he remained committed to his mission, to succeed without losing his integrity, to prove that success transcended race, and to inspire others from similar backgrounds to follow in his footsteps. As he reached his seat, Daniel was momentarily taken aback. His business class seat was a plush, spacious chair by the window, and he sank into it, appreciating the comfort it offered. He pulled out his tablet, intent on catching up on some reading before takeoff. However, he couldn't shake a feeling of something lingering in the air, a slight shift in the energy around him, as if he'd crossed an invisible boundary. After a few moments, a flight attendant approached, her polite smile fixed, though her gaze held a similar uncertainty as the gate attendant's. She cleared her throat as if preparing to deliver unpleasant news. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice soft and hesitant. "May I please see your boarding pass again?" Daniel looked up, mildly surprised. "Of course," he replied, pulling the pass from his pocket and handing it to her. She studied it, her eyes darting between him and the ticket, her expression one of mild confusion mixed with a hint of something else, a guarded suspicion. He watched her face closely, waiting for her to explain. After an uncomfortably long pause, she handed the pass back to him, though her posture suggested she wasn't done. "Mr. Wright, I apologize, but there seems to be a system error with your seat assignment. I'm going to have to ask you to move to economy class." Her words were polite, but her tone lacked conviction, as though even she didn't believe her own explanation. A chill passed through Daniel as he processed her words. "A system error?" he repeated, a skeptical edge to his tone. He looked around the cabin, noticing several empty seats in business class, and even first class beyond that. "My seat is valid," he said, his voice steady. "I'll stay right here. Thank you." The flight attendant's expression tightened and she glanced around, visibly uncomfortable. She opened her mouth to reply, but seemed unsure of how to proceed. "I understand, sir, but—" "Let's be clear," Daniel interrupted, meeting her gaze firmly. "Is there actually a system error here, or is there something else going on?" His tone was calm, but there was no mistaking the warning note in his voice. The attendant flushed, looking taken aback. She glanced at another flight attendant nearby, who seemed to sense the tension and approached to support her. Mr. Wright, the second attendant, a senior member of the crew, intervened. "We apologize for the inconvenience, but we're simply trying to resolve this matter before we take off." Daniel's frustration began to simmer. It was a familiar situation. Subtle judgments and unfounded assumptions based on who people thought he should be or shouldn't be. He took a deep breath, reminding himself that losing his temper wouldn't help. Instead, he replied, "I'd like to speak to someone in charge. I'll be remaining in my seat until then." The tension was palpable as Daniel settled back into his business class seat, keeping his face neutral. The surrounding passengers glanced his way, murmuring quietly, some watching with curiosity, others with undisguised judgment. He could feel the weight of their stares, but he kept his gaze forward, choosing to ignore it. Over the years, he'd learned to mask his reactions, but he couldn't shake the question gnawing at him. Was this system error just a pretext? Moments later, a junior flight attendant returned with the senior cabin manager, a middle-aged woman named Laura. She wore a polite, professional smile, though her eyes betrayed a hint of annoyance. Laura walked up to Daniel's seat with a controlled posture, her hands clasped in front of her. "Mr. Wright," she began, her voice careful but firm, "I'm the senior cabin manager. There's been a technical issue with the seating arrangements, and we would really appreciate it if you could help us resolve this by moving to economy class just for this flight. We'll be happy to compensate you." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "With respect, Laura, I've paid for this seat and planned my trip accordingly. I've faced similar situations before, but this time I'm curious. Is it truly a technical issue, or am I not supposed to be here for another reason?" Laura blinked, visibly taken aback. She faltered for a second, then quickly recovered, the practiced smile back in place. "Of course, it's just a technical error, sir. But we have a full manifest, and your cooperation would help us avoid further delays." He took a slow, measured breath, feeling a blend of disappointment and determination. "Laura, I'm not moving. You'll have to resolve this issue another way." For the first time, he saw a flicker of frustration flash across Laura's face, quickly replaced by a feigned, overly polite expression. "Very well," she said, glancing down at the other flight attendant. "Excuse us a moment." As she turned, Daniel noticed her subtly gesturing toward two men in suits seated nearby. He felt his stomach tighten. These were security agents, likely undercover air marshals. The tension in the cabin thickened as one of them rose, his gaze fixed on Daniel with a mixture of wariness and resolve. The security officer approached Daniel, his stance firm. "Sir, I'd like to ask you to cooperate with the cabin crew's instructions," he said in a low, steady tone, as if trying to avoid further escalating the situation. Daniel remained calm, maintaining eye contact. "Am I being threatened with removal from a seat I paid for? I have no intention of causing any disturbance. My presence here is not disrupting anyone else's experience." The officer's expression softened slightly, as though reassessing the situation. "It's not a threat, sir," he replied cautiously. "It's just a matter of protocol. We're here to support the crew's decisions." A beat of silence passed, and just when it seemed Daniel was left with no choice but to comply, another passenger, a woman sitting across the aisle, spoke up. "Excuse me," she said, her tone sharp, cutting through the tension. "Are you seriously going to move this man just because he's sitting in a business class seat he paid for?" Her voice carried, and a few other passengers nodded in agreement, sensing the unfairness of the situation. Emboldened, the woman continued, "I fly with this airline frequently, and I've never seen a system error result in someone being moved from business class to economy. I'd like to see the policy on that. Actually," the security officer and Laura exchanged uneasy glances. More passengers began to murmur in agreement, and a few raised their voices in protest, questioning why Daniel was being asked to move. The crowd support felt surreal to Daniel, who, despite his resilience, hadn't expected anyone to intervene. Just as the situation was reaching a fever pitch, the captain himself appeared, emerging from the cockpit with a grave expression. He walked directly toward Daniel, the eyes of every passenger following his every move. As he reached Daniel, he extended his hand, and for a moment, Daniel assumed he was simply there to insist on the cabin crew's orders. Instead, the captain cleared his throat and, in a calm voice, said, "Mr. Wright, I'd like to personally apologize for this misunderstanding. You have every right to remain in your seat." He turned to Laura, his expression shifting to something sharper. "Ms. Morrison, could I speak with you in private for a moment?" Laura's face drained of color, her confidence visibly shaken. The captain led her a few paces away, though the passengers could still catch snippets of the conversation. "I don't understand," Laura whispered fiercely. "He's refusing to cooperate with our crew. Protocol clearly states." The captain interrupted her. "Did you not check his credentials? Do you even realize who Mr. Wright is?" The captain's voice was firm, and though his tone was low, his words rang out, causing murmurs to ripple through the passengers. The shock was evident in Laura's face. She stammered, I assumed he was just a passenger." The captain nodded, his voice laced with quiet reprimand. "Yes, and a passenger who happens to be the owner of this airline." Laura's mouth dropped open, her face frozen in stunned silence. She looked back at Daniel, who watched the exchange with a steady gaze. The passengers, now catching on to the true nature of Daniel's identity, began whispering in hushed tones. The woman who had spoken up earlier looked at him with renewed respect, while others gawked, seemingly embarrassed by their initial judgments. Laura turned back to Daniel, clearly flustered, but trying to recover her composure. "Mr. Wright, I apologize," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "This was an error in judgment on my part." Daniel didn't respond immediately. He simply regarded her with a calm but piercing gaze, one that spoke volumes. "Thank you for the apology," he said eventually, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "But you should understand that it isn't just me who faces this. Countless others in similar situations are expected to prove they belong, time and time again." The cabin was silent, every passenger attentive, absorbing the weight of his words. The captain nodded to Daniel and respectfully addressed the cabin. "On behalf of our crew, I apologize for any inconvenience caused. We'll be taking off shortly." As the captain returned to the cockpit and Laura retreated to her station, Daniel glanced out the window, feeling a strange mixture of satisfaction and sadness. The experience had been uncomfortable, yet it had served as a reminder of the biases still ingrained in society. As the plane prepared for takeoff, the woman across the aisle caught his eye, giving him a nod of solidarity. For Daniel, this moment would serve as more than a personal victory. It was an impetus to enact deeper changes within his airline, to ensure that respect was afforded to every individual who walked through its doors. With the plane finally airborne, a sense of calm seemed to settle over the cabin. Passengers returned to their seats, some still throwing discreet glances in Daniel's direction. The hum of the engine served as a background to his thoughts as he looked out at the clouds, grateful that the embarrassing confrontation was over. Yet he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that this experience, like countless others before, had shown just how deep biases ran, even within his own airline. But as he considered potential changes to make for his company, the captain's voice broke through his thoughts over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've just been informed of unexpected turbulence along our flight path. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts as we navigate through it." Within seconds, the plane jolted, dropping momentarily before leveling out. Daniel gripped his armrest instinctively, and from around him, startled gasps and worried murmurs rose. He forced himself to relax, reminding himself that turbulence was common, though the cabin lights flickered ominously as the plane shook again. Suddenly, Laura, the senior cabin manager, came rushing down the aisle, visibly rattled. She seemed almost frantic as she checked passengers' seat belts, moving with quick, jerky motions. When she reached Daniel's row, she paused, her face flushed. "Mr. Wright," she said, her voice breathless. I'd like to apologize again for earlier. I should have handled the situation more respectfully." Daniel studied her, noticing the genuine nervousness beneath her attempt at politeness. "Thank you, Laura," he replied evenly, though his tone made it clear he wasn't looking for more apologies. "It's not just about respect for me. It's about making sure everyone is treated with it." She nodded, appearing both relieved and humbled, then moved on to check the other passengers. As she hurried away, another violent shake rocked the plane, more severe this time, causing the overhead compartments to rattle and several passengers to cry out. One man's water bottle flew down the aisle, while a nearby child clung to her mother, her wide eyes filled with fear. As the cabin grew increasingly tense, a voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain again. We're experiencing unexpected severe turbulence. We ask you to please remain calm and stay seated." Then, without warning, the lights in the cabin went out entirely, leaving only dim emergency lighting to cast shadows across anxious faces. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. He looked around, and in the dim light, he noticed something unusual. The two undercover security agents were moving with purpose toward the back of the plane, where the economy class cabin was. The unease that had taken root in him earlier deepened. What were they doing back there during a situation like this? He leaned into the aisle slightly, trying to see where they went, but they were quickly swallowed by the darkness at the rear of the plane. Just as he was about to settle back into his seat, he heard a muffled commotion behind him, a thud, followed by a series of sharp, urgent voices. Other passengers glanced nervously over their shoulders, their curiosity mixing with fear as the turbulence worsened, making it difficult to stay focused on anything else. But soon, another voice, a man's loud and commanding, rang out, cutting through the murmur of the cabin. "Stay in your seats, everyone. This is not a drill." One of the undercover officers appeared back in the cabin, moving quickly down the aisle, his hand resting on the gun holstered under his jacket. He stopped briefly near the flight attendants, his voice lowered, though Daniel could still catch fragments of his words. "Secure the cabin, potential threat. Remain calm." A threat? Daniel's pulse quickened. He'd dealt with intense situations in boardrooms and hostile negotiations, but this was different. He wasn't prepared to face a crisis at 35,000 feet. Instinctively, he tightened his seatbelt, leaning forward slightly, straining to hear any other hints of what was happening. Then, almost as suddenly as the turbulence had begun, the plane stabilized. The lights flickered back on, illuminating the worried faces around him. But the sense of relief was short-lived as one of the security officers returned to the cabin with a grim expression, his gaze sweeping over the passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the disturbance," he announced, his tone professional but tense. "Due to an unexpected security concern, we'll need to make an emergency landing. Please remain seated and keep your seatbelts fastened. We'll provide further instructions shortly." The murmur of questions and confusion among the passengers swelled, and Daniel noticed that Laura looked pale, her hands clutching her tablet with white knuckles. She made eye contact with him briefly, a flicker of desperation in her eyes, as if silently seeking reassurance. Though they'd had a tense start, he felt a responsibility to stay calm, if only to set an example for those around him. "What kind of threat?" A passenger called out from across the aisle, his voice laced with panic. "Is it a bomb?" The officer shook his head firmly, raising his hands to calm the crowd. "We can't disclose details at this moment, but please know that the situation is under control." His words did little to reassure the passengers, who only grew louder with worried speculation. The captain's voice returned over the intercom. "We've been cleared for an emergency landing at a nearby airstrip. The situation requires immediate attention, so please follow the crew's instructions." Daniel could feel the aircraft descending, his ears popping as they dropped in altitude. He looked around, assessing his surroundings. Laura was making her rounds again, ensuring everyone was prepared for landing. She stopped by Daniel's seat, her eyes filled with regret and something else, respect. "Mr. Wright," she said quietly, "thank you for your patience. I know this isn't how you should have been treated, and I appreciate your composure." He gave her a brief nod, sensing the sincerity in her tone. "Just make sure everyone gets off this plane safely. That's what matters right now." As they continued their rapid descent, the lights flickered one last time, then stabilized. The tension seemed to thicken with each passing second, each passenger clinging to their seat as the ground loomed closer. The plane landed hard, bouncing slightly before the wheels caught firmly on the tarmac. The emergency cruise skill was clear as they guided the aircraft down the runway, bringing it to a shuddering halt at a secluded airstrip. The intercom clicked on again. "This is your captain speaking. We've successfully completed our emergency landing. Emergency personnel are en route to assist." A collective sigh of relief rippled through the cabin, though nerves remained on edge. As the crew prepared to open the doors, Daniel noticed Laura glancing at him one last time, her expression grateful yet haunted by the day's events. Once the doors opened, the passengers were led out onto the tarmac, where emergency personnel stood ready. Daniel stayed near the back of the line, observing as people filed out, shaken but safe. He made a silent promise to himself. The biases and assumptions he'd faced that day would serve as a catalyst, sparking changes within his airline. He had a newfound purpose, not just as an owner, but as a leader dedicated to setting an example of fairness and respect for all. As the passengers disembarked, Daniel lingered on the tarmac, watching as emergency personnel guided everyone to a nearby terminal building that was empty at this hour. The atmosphere buzzed with tension, yet a palpable sense of relief filled the air. Once inside, passengers dispersed into small groups, sharing their versions of the mid-air ordeal. Daniel noticed Laura pacing near a row of seats, looking like she was on the edge of unraveling. For a moment, he considered approaching her, but before he could, one of the undercover security officers caught his attention. The officer approached Daniel directly, his face no longer neutral but tinged with respect. "Mr. Wright, could I speak with you privately?" Surprised, Daniel nodded and followed the officer down a quiet hallway away from the others. The officer led him to a small conference room, where the second security agent, a woman, waited. She was on her phone, speaking in hushed tones before quickly ending the call. "Mr. Wright," she began, her tone both professional and apologetic, "I'm Agent Harris, and this is Agent Lewis. We apologize for the abruptness of our actions, but we needed to act quickly due to the security concern on board." "Security concern?" Daniel raised an eyebrow, leaning forward. "Are you saying the turbulence wasn't the real issue?" Lewis nodded grimly. "Correct. We received a tip just before takeoff that someone on this flight might attempt to tamper with critical aircraft systems." Daniel's mind raced. "A tip? Why wasn't I informed sooner? And how did this involve me?" Harris hesitated before replying. "Well, sir, we were advised to keep this information classified to avoid causing unnecessary panic. However, we've discovered that the security breach might actually involve someone within the airline's own staff." Daniel's expression hardened. This wasn't just a case of turbulence. His own employees could be putting his passengers in danger. The revelation hit him like a shockwave. He'd spent years building the airline, carefully curating a team he thought he could trust. "We need to understand if you might know of any employees who could be disgruntled or involved in suspicious activity," Harris continued, studying his reaction closely. "And given your unique position, we thought you might be able to help us investigate further." The implication was clear. They wanted him to consider the possibility that someone within his company, someone he might even know, had intended harm. The thought sent a chill down his spine, and he couldn't help but wonder who might have been behind this. "Well, there are always people with grievances," he said finally, his voice measured. "It's the nature of any business. But I never expected anyone to put lives at risk. I can't think of anyone who would go this far." Just then the door opened and Laura stepped in, visibly flustered. She looked at Daniel, then at the agents and back to Daniel, her expression unreadable. Is everything all right?" she asked, her voice quivering. Agent Lewis glanced at her briefly. Ms. Morrison, we need to ask if you've noticed any unusual activity among the crew lately. Laura's face went pale. She hesitated, then slowly nodded. Actually, yes. There were rumors among the crew about certain changes Mr. Wright was considering. Possible layoffs in some departments. I didn't think much of it, but there were a few people unhappy with the company's direction. Daniel's brow furrowed. He had indeed been considering streamlining operations, but he hadn't expected that news to travel so quickly. He made a mental note to investigate these leaks. Who was the most vocal about this? Harris pressed. Laura looked uncomfortable, wringing her hands. There was one person in particular, Ethan Blake, one of the engineers. He's been with the company for a while and has always been reliable, but recently he's been acting strangely. He even mentioned a reckoning coming, though I thought he was just venting. Daniel felt a pang of betrayal. Ethan had been with him since the early days of the airline. If anyone should have been loyal, it was him. Ethan, he murmured, half to himself. Why would he? Just then, an alert beeped on Agent Lewis's phone. She glanced down, her eyes widening slightly. Sir, we just received information from airport security. It appears Ethan never boarded the plane, but he did pass through the crew access area right before takeoff. A stunned silence settled over the room as the implication hit them all. He must have tampered with something before we took off, Daniel said, his voice a mixture of shock and anger. But why? What could he possibly gain from this? Harris looked grim. We're still piecing it together, but based on preliminary information, it seems Ethan might have sabotaged the systems to create turbulence, intending to ground the flight. This was never about crashing the plane. It was about forcing it to land, likely to make some kind of statement. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but questions still remained. Daniel couldn't believe that someone he trusted would go to such lengths, but the more he thought about it, the clearer the picture became. Ethan had always been outspoken, often challenging Daniel's decisions, but Daniel had considered it a sign of his dedication, not discontent. Where is he now? Daniel demanded, his voice icy. We don't know, Harris admitted. He was seen leaving the airport in a hurry right after the flight took off. He's now officially wanted by authorities for questioning. Laura's face had gone pale. She looked at Daniel, her eyes filled with guilt. I should have said something sooner, Mr. Wright. I thought he was just blowing off steam. But now... Daniel gave her a reassuring look. You couldn't have known, Laura. None of us could. The important thing is that we know now, and we'll make sure he's brought to justice. As the agents left to coordinate with local authorities, Daniel stood alone in the room, deep in thought. This incident was a wake-up call, and it brought with it the sobering realization that trust, even among close employees, could sometimes be misplaced. But it also strengthened his resolve. If anything, this ordeal would reinforce his mission to instill fairness, respect, and accountability in his company's culture. When he stepped out of the room, he noticed the passengers were being offered accommodations while the investigation continued. Laura was speaking with some of them, her professionalism back in place despite the strain on her face. When she saw him, she approached cautiously. Mr. Wright, thank you for not, holding today's events against me. I want to do whatever I can to help set things right, she said quietly. He nodded, appreciating her sincerity. Laura, if there's anything this day has shown me, it's that there's work to do, starting with making sure our crew feels secure, valued, and respected. When we get back, I'd like you to be part of that process. Her face lit up with a renewed sense of purpose, and she nodded. I'd be honored, sir. As Daniel left the terminal that night, he couldn't shake the surreal events of the day, but he was more determined than ever to make his airline a place where no one, regardless of background or position, ever had to question their value or feel undermined. He had a plan, and he knew it wouldn't be easy. But just as he'd fought to build his airline from the ground up, he was ready to fight once again, to reshape it into something that could withstand any storm, even the kind that came from within. The following morning, Daniel returned to his office determined to address the aftermath of the previous day's incident. His first step was a full review of his employees' files, starting with Ethan Blake. He scrolled through Ethan's profile, and something caught his eye. Ethan's initial application had been marked as flagged. It was an anomaly Daniel hadn't noticed before, one that warranted investigation. His assistant, Marcus, entered the room with a stack of reports, which included a message from the airport security team. "Sir, security footage confirms Ethan tampered with the avionics panel shortly before the flight. They're also digging into his past connections. Apparently, there's more to him than we thought." Daniel sat back, letting the words sink in. He pulled up his own records, meticulously sifting through Ethan's history with the company, and found a startling detail. Ethan had been part of a failed acquisition attempt. An older airline Daniel had once considered buying, but abandoned when he learned of the rampant mismanagement within it. Ethan's file noted him as a lead engineer on the failing airline's team before joining Daniel's. Could Ethan have resented him for pulling out of the acquisition? Or perhaps he harbored animosity for other reasons, unfulfilled ambitions, or grudges over missed opportunities. As he pieced through the information, Marcus added quietly, "Sir, there's something else." An anonymous email was sent to our customer relations team about 2 months ago. The message criticized the company's management and hinted at problems from within. At the time, we dismissed it as just another disgruntled employee complaint. Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Bring that email to me," he ordered. Something told him Ethan might have left more breadcrumbs than they'd initially realized. Within minutes, Marcus returned with a printed copy of the email. It read, "Your image may be polished, but it's only a matter of time before the cracks show. Change is coming, whether you're ready or not. Some people don't forget easily." The language was cryptic yet chilling, its tone suggesting more than a mere complaint. There was an anger simmering in the words, as if a personal grudge lay beneath the veneer of professionalism. Daniel scanned the message again, unease pooling in his stomach. He'd encountered challenges, but this level of calculated sabotage, this was personal. The thought jolted him back to a buried memory. Years earlier, he had narrowly avoided a significant scandal with a failed business venture, a manufacturing company in which he'd partnered with another investor. The fallout had been swift, with the blame unfairly falling on Daniel's shoulders, tarnishing his reputation for months. Could Ethan somehow be connected to that? Just then, a knock interrupted his thoughts. It was Agent Harris, looking as if she hadn't slept. "Mr. Wright," she began, glancing over her shoulder as she closed the door. "We found something that might interest you. We believe Ethan might be working with a known group that targets high-profile executives, individuals they see as symbols of corporate greed." Daniel's jaw tightened. "You're saying there's an organized effort to undermine my company?" "Yes, and Ethan isn't acting alone. We found a secure message thread on his phone, suggesting he's in contact with at least one other insider." She handed him a printed transcript of the messages, each one more concerning than the last. Asterisk, the turbulence event is just the beginning. He needs to feel the same loss he caused us. Once we're inside, he won't see it coming. The messages dripped with a simmering fury, a vendetta aimed specifically at Daniel. It was now clear that his success had turned him into a target. As they talked, Daniel's phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. He glanced down and froze when he saw it was from Ethan. "Didn't expect me to have allies, did you? You should have taken the deal when you had the chance. But it's too late now." Fury and frustration boiled within him, but he kept his composure. This wasn't the time to react impulsively. He called Agent Harris's attention to the message, and she immediately flagged it as part of their investigation. Over the next hours, as they analyzed Ethan's potential motives and connections, Harris shared that they suspected Ethan's vendetta stemmed from a complex web of influences beyond the failed airline acquisition. It appeared that Ethan had joined forces with a shadowy network known for exposing corporate corruption, sometimes justly, but often with reckless and devastating results. They would stop at nothing to achieve their goals. Agent Harris frowned. This group Ethan's tied to They aren't just protesting corporate behavior. They exploit vulnerabilities in business operations, sabotage public perception, and attack reputations. They specialize in making their targets paranoid, isolated. Daniel felt a chill run through him. His every move, every decision, could be exploited or misconstrued to feed this group's agenda. Yet he couldn't back down. This was his company, his life's work. But he knew that a more calculated approach was essential. "Tell me," Daniel said, an edge of defiance in his voice. "How can we turn this around?" Harris thought for a moment. "We need to gain leverage on Ethan and his associates. We could set up a controlled communication channel to lure them into revealing more of their plans. But it would mean taking a personal risk, giving them a sense that you're rattled." Daniel nodded, determination stealing his resolve. "If that's what it takes to get to the bottom of this, I'm willing." With Harris's help, they crafted a series of strategic messages and social media posts, each one carefully curated to signal apparent concerns within his company. They crafted messages indicating potential changes and a supposed restructuring that would address financial losses. Daniel made a cryptic public statement, hinting at a forthcoming big change, fueling speculation and inviting comments that would likely draw out Ethan's associates. In the days that followed, the response was immediate. The anonymous account that had sent the initial email resurfaced, responding publicly to Daniel's statement with mocking comments about his leadership. Daniel received another message from the unknown number. "So, you're finally facing reality. Don't bother trying to turn it around. It's far too late." Daniel sent back a calculated reply. "Maybe so, but it's my reality to face, and I won't back down." Agent Harris monitored the responses, and soon enough, they tracked down a suspect linked to the group, a disgruntled former employee who'd been quietly feeding Ethan inside information. With the suspect in custody, law enforcement uncovered a network of contacts Ethan had been using to facilitate his sabotage. It turned out that this network extended to Daniel's competitors, who, unaware of the larger sabotage, had unintentionally provided some resources. Finally, with enough evidence, authorities traced the network back to Ethan himself. Harris orchestrated a sting operation, bringing Ethan into custody along with his co-conspirators. Days later, as the dust began to settle, Daniel walked through his headquarters with a renewed sense of purpose. Employees stopped to greet him, and he felt a warmth and unity he hadn't felt in months. He called an all-hands meeting, addressing his team candidly, acknowledging the challenges they had faced, and emphasizing the need for transparency, respect, and unity moving forward. Standing before his team, he declared, "We've been through a storm, but we're still here, stronger than ever. This experience has shown me that our strength lies not just in our success, but in our resilience and integrity. Together, we'll rebuild not just a company, but a culture of trust and excellence." As he left the meeting, Laura approached him with a small smile. "Mr. Wright, I want to thank you for giving us all a voice in how we move forward." Daniel returned her smile. "It's the least I can do. This experience has been a wake-up call for me as well. Now, it's time we start fresh and build a legacy we can all be proud of." For Daniel, the journey wasn't over, but he knew that with his company's newfound resilience, they were ready for whatever lay ahead. And as he looked out over his team, he felt something he hadn't in a long time, a renewed hope for the future. Weeks passed, and the air at Wright Airlines headquarters was electric with the fresh energy of a new beginning. Daniel implemented a thorough review process, examining everything from operational protocols to employee engagement. He had set up an internal audit team, led by none other than Laura, who demonstrated both loyalty and courage through the company's recent trials. With her attention to detail, he trusted her to keep the company's standards high. One morning, while Daniel was meeting with the board to share updates on the new protocols, an email notification popped up on his screen. The subject line read, "Final warning." Daniel's heart pounded as he opened the email. The message was brief but unsettling. "We're still here. You can't undo the damage you've caused. Expect us." The message was anonymous, Yet it mirrored the same veiled threats from the previous group tied to Ethan. Was it possible that the network was larger than they'd suspected? Or perhaps there were others within his company who had yet to be exposed? Trying not to reveal his unease, Daniel excused himself from the meeting and immediately called Agent Harris. Within the hour, she was in his office, her expression mirroring his concern. "Daniel," she said. "Scanning through the email, our intel indicated that Ethan's circle of associates was more expansive than we'd initially thought. This email suggests there's still someone else connected to your company. It could be another employee, or possibly even someone on the board." Daniel's mind raced. He'd always valued loyalty and integrity, but now he was forced to confront the reality that trust had been compromised at every level. He began to question everyone around him, even those he'd known for years. How deep did the betrayal go? In response, Harris advised implementing a series of undercover protocols. With her help, Daniel placed hidden monitoring systems on key company channels, giving them insight into who was accessing sensitive data and from where. It was a risky move, but Daniel knew he had no choice. If someone was still trying to sabotage his company, he needed to find them before they struck again. Over the following days, subtle hints began to emerge from the digital monitoring. One user ID in particular, labeled Raven, appeared multiple times, accessing files that had nothing to do with their position in the company. Cross-referencing the activity with employee data, Daniel and Harris were stunned to discover that Raven was actually one of Daniel's senior executives, a trusted advisor he'd known for years. Thomas Gray. Thomas had joined the company during its early stages and had always presented himself as Daniel's most loyal supporter. But now, the pieces were starting to fall into place. Thomas had connections to the failed airline that Daniel had backed out of years ago, the same one that had been Ethan's previous employer. The realization hit Daniel hard. Thomas had brought Ethan on board as a part of a calculated revenge plot that spanned years. Harris suggested setting a trap to confirm their suspicions and reveal Thomas's intentions once and for all. Daniel decided to host a mock meeting where he would announce a supposed merger with a rival airline, a move he knew Thomas would hate, and a scenario that would push him to reveal himself. When the day of the meeting arrived, Daniel addressed the board with carefully chosen words. "After careful consideration, we've decided that a merger is the best move for Wright Airlines," he announced, eyeing Thomas, who looked visibly taken aback. "This partnership will introduce new leadership positions, and we'll be streamlining certain departments." As expected, Thomas couldn't hide his anger. "Daniel, with all due respect, merging with a rival is a betrayal of everything this company stands for," he said, trying to keep his voice even but failing. His face flushed as he continued. Wright Airlines was built on independence and innovation. A merger would erase that legacy. "Perhaps," Daniel responded calmly, "but sometimes a change in direction can be what's best for everyone." He leaned forward, watching Thomas carefully, especially for those who claimed to support the company's interests. A silence hung in the air as Thomas struggled to mask his frustration. When the meeting ended, he stormed out of the boardroom, heading straight to his office. Unbeknownst to him, Agent Harris had tapped his office line, and within minutes, he placed a call. Daniel and Harris listened as Thomas contacted a familiar number, one they'd identified as Ethan's associate. "You were right," Thomas hissed into the phone. "He's taking the company in a direction we can't stand by. We need to act now." With that, Thomas had sealed his fate. Harris moved quickly, arresting Thomas before he could enact any further plans. Under interrogation, he confessed to orchestrating Ethan's involvement. Driven by a mix of resentment over the failed acquisition and his frustration with Daniel's growing success, he revealed that he'd seen Daniel as a symbol of everything he believed was wrong with the industry, a scapegoat for the opportunities he felt he'd missed out on. The final piece of the puzzle was in place. With Thomas's arrest, the sabotage network within Wright Airlines was officially dismantled, and Daniel could finally breathe a sigh of relief. The company, his employees, and his own reputation were safe once again. In the weeks that followed, Daniel took steps to reinforce trust and transparency within the company. He held open forums, listening to his employees' thoughts on how they could improve the company culture. He even set up an anonymous feedback system where employees could voice concerns without fear of retribution. The experience had been harrowing, but it had also reminded him of the values that had driven him to start his company in the first place. Standing before his team, he reflected on the challenges they'd overcome and the lessons he'd learned. "This journey has taught me something," he said in his closing speech to the employees. "Success isn't just about what we build. It's about who we build it with. From here on, I want Wright Airlines to be a place where every voice matters, where respect and integrity are our strongest pillars. Together, we'll take this company to new heights." As the room erupted in applause, Daniel looked around, feeling a renewed sense of hope and camaraderie. The scars from the ordeal would remain, but they served as a reminder of what he and his team were capable of overcoming. And as he walked out of the room, he knew one thing for certain. Wright Airlines was no longer just a business. It was a family, stronger and more united than ever, ready to soar into a brighter future.